Alexander the Great's darkest secret that history books left out. The year is 324 BC. Alexander stands at the peak of power unlike anything the ancient world has ever seen. From the mountains of Greece to the distant frontiers of India, his empire stretches across continents. Kings bow before him. Entire civilizations answer to his command. The Persian Empire, once considered invincible, lies broken beneath his feet. No rival remains strong enough to challenge him. No battlefield remains unconquered. To the world, Alexander is more than a king. He is a legend still alive. His soldiers have followed him through deserts that seemed endless, across rivers that swallowed armies, and into battles that should have been impossible to win. They have watched him charge directly into enemy lines. They have seen him survive wounds that would have killed ordinary men. Many have begun to believe that fate itself walks beside him. History remembers this version of Alexander: the military genius, the fearless commander, the undefeated conqueror. But there is a problem. The closer Alexander came to absolute power, the more uneasy some of the people around him became. Not his enemies, not defeated kings, not foreign rebels, the men who had known him for years, the men who had fought beside him, the men who had helped him build the greatest empire of his age. Ancient sources preserve strange clues hidden between stories of triumph and conquest. Small details, uncomfortable incidents, moments that seem out of place in the life of a celebrated hero. Individually, they appear insignificant. Together, they reveal a disturbing possibility. What if Alexander's darkest secret was never buried beneath the ruins of a lost city? What if it was never hidden inside a forgotten tomb? What if the greatest mystery surrounding Alexander the Great was the transformation that occurred after he achieved everything he had ever dreamed of? Because power changes people. History has shown it again and again, and no one in the ancient world possessed more power than Alexander. The question is not whether he conquered the world. The question is what that conquest did to him. As we follow the final years of his extraordinary life, we will uncover a story far different from the legend taught in most history books. A story of ambition without limits, loyalty tested by fear, friendships destroyed by suspicion, and a ruler who may have become trapped by the very success that made him immortal. Did Alexander conquer the world, or did power ultimately conquer Alexander? The perfect hero history created. History remembers Alexander the Great as if he were born for greatness. The image is familiar: a young king leading armies across continents, defeating enemies that outnumbered him, and accomplishing in little more than a decade what entire dynasties failed to achieve over centuries. To millions of people, Alexander became the ultimate symbol of courage, intelligence, and military genius. His victories transformed him into something larger than a ruler. He became a legend while he was still alive. The foundations of that legend were built on real achievements. At an age when most rulers were still proving themselves, Alexander inherited a fragile kingdom surrounded by rivals waiting for an opportunity to strike. Instead of defending his position, he launched one of the most ambitious campaigns in history. City after city fell before him. Kingdom after kingdom submitted to his authority. Every victory seemed to confirm that he possessed an extraordinary understanding of warfare that his opponents could never match. His soldiers played a crucial role in creating the myth. They watched him ride into the most dangerous parts of battle. They saw him suffer wounds that should have ended his campaigns. They witnessed moments when defeat appeared inevitable, only for Alexander to reverse the situation through speed, audacity, and sheer determination. To the men fighting beside him, it often seemed as though fortune itself favored their king. Stories of these events spread across the ancient world, growing larger with every retelling. But legends are rarely built from facts alone. They are shaped by memory. Victories are remembered. Contradictions are forgotten. Successful risks become proof of genius, while mistakes fade into the background. Over time, the public image becomes stronger than the reality. The more Alexander conquered, the more difficult it became for anyone to separate the man from the myth. The hero people admired was slowly becoming an idea rather than a human being. Yet hidden within the accounts of ancient historians are details that do not fit the familiar narrative. Small incidents, moments of tension, conflicts involving men who had once been among Alexander's most trusted companions. These stories received far less attention than the great battles, but they reveal something important. While the outside world celebrated an invincible conqueror, those closest to him were beginning to witness changes that could not be explained by military success alone. The greatest challenge facing historians today is not understanding how Alexander conquered so much territory. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The real challenge is understanding what happened after he achieved those victories, because power has a way of transforming even the most remarkable individuals. The further Alexander moved from the ordinary limits of human achievement, the further he seemed to move from the people who had known him since the beginning. And that raises a question few history books are willing to ask. If Alexander truly became the perfect hero celebrated throughout history, why did some of his oldest companions begin looking at him with growing concern? The answer begins with a dangerous problem that no conqueror had ever faced before. What happens when there are no worlds left to conquer, but the hunger for conquest remains? When no victory feels big enough. By the time Alexander reached his late 20s, he had already achieved more than most rulers could accomplish in a lifetime. The Persian Empire had fallen. Egypt recognized him as its ruler. Vast territories stretching across Asia answered to his authority. The dream that had motivated generations of Macedonian kings had not only been fulfilled, but exceeded beyond imagination. Yet instead of slowing down, consolidating his empire, or securing what he had won, Alexander continued looking east. To many around him, it was becoming increasingly difficult to understand why. At first, his ambition appeared rational. Every new campaign could be explained as a strategic necessity. Defeat one enemy to prevent a future threat, secure one region to protect another, expand influence to stabilize the frontier. These arguments made sense while powerful rivals still existed. But as the years passed, a different pattern emerged. The further Alexander advanced, the more distant the finish line seemed to become. Each victory created a new objective. Every conquered territory opened the path to another campaign. Success was no longer bringing closure. It was creating momentum. For his soldiers, the burden was becoming impossible to ignore. They had marched thousands of miles from their homeland. They had crossed deserts under relentless heat, climbed mountains where entire armies could disappear, and fought battles against unfamiliar enemies in lands they could barely pronounce. Many had followed Alexander since the beginning. They admired him. They respected him. Yet even among his most loyal veterans, a question was beginning to spread through the ranks. How much farther could this continue? What makes Alexander's story unique is that his greatest challenge may not have come from an enemy army. It may have come from a psychological reality few people ever experience. Most individuals spend their lives pursuing goals they never fully reach. Alexander experienced the opposite. Before turning 30, he had surpassed nearly every ambition imaginable. The world he had dreamed of conquering was already beneath his feet. Instead of satisfaction, however, he seemed driven by an even greater urgency. It was as if achievement itself had become insufficient. Ancient accounts suggest that India became the symbol of this obsession. Beyond the known maps lay new territories, new kingdoms, and new opportunities for glory. Alexander spoke of reaching the ends of the world and the outer ocean believed to surround the earth. To him, stopping may have felt more dangerous than continuing. A conqueror whose identity was built on expansion could not easily redefine himself as a ruler, administrator, or statesman. The man who had spent his entire adult life moving forward may have discovered that he no longer knew how to stand still. His generals were among the first to recognize the change. These were not fearful men. They had shared countless dangers with Alexander and benefited enormously from his victories. Yet many began questioning whether the empire's objectives still matched reality. The gap between practical strategy and personal ambition seemed to widen with every campaign. What Alexander viewed as destiny, others increasingly viewed as risk. The tension remained largely hidden, but it was growing beneath the surface of the empire. Soon that tension would evolve into something far more significant, because as Alexander pushed farther beyond the limits of the known world, another transformation was taking place. It was not happening on the battlefield. It was happening within his sense of identity. And before long, the conqueror who had defeated kings would begin seeing himself as something greater than a king. The moment a king started believing he was a god. The deeper Alexander marched into the east, the further he moved away from the world that had shaped him. The young Macedonian king who had crossed into Asia years earlier was now ruling a vast empire made up of dozens of cultures, languages, religions, and traditions. Maintaining control over such an enormous territory required more than military strength. It required legitimacy. Alexander understood this better than most rulers. But somewhere along that path, political strategy and personal identity began to blur. In Egypt, priests welcomed him as the son of a divine figure. At the oasis of Siwa, one of the most mysterious religious centers in the ancient world, he consulted the famous oracle of Amun. What exactly was said during that meeting remains unknown. Ancient sources disagree. Some accounts suggest the priests recognized him as possessing a divine connection. Others claim the event was misunderstood or exaggerated. Yet what mattered was not what happened inside the temple. What mattered was what Alexander believed afterward. As he expanded deeper into former Persian territories, he began adopting customs that many Macedonians found uncomfortable. Persian kings had long been treated as figures standing above ordinary humanity. Ceremonies emphasized distance, reverence, and near-sacred authority. Alexander increasingly embraced these traditions. He wore elements of royal Persian dress. He surrounded himself with rituals unfamiliar to his homeland. To the peoples of the East, these actions reinforced his legitimacy. To many Macedonians, they felt like signs that their king was changing into someone they no longer recognized. The tension became especially visible through the practice known as proskynesis. In parts of the Persian world, subjects bowed deeply before the ruler as a sign of respect. For Macedonians and Greeks, however, such gestures were often reserved for gods. Asking free men to perform these acts before another human being crossed a cultural line. When Alexander attempted to introduce elements of this tradition into his court, resistance emerged immediately. Some obeyed. Others remained silent. A few openly objected. The issue was no longer about ceremony. It was about identity. Those who had known Alexander since childhood remembered the son of Philip II. They remembered a brilliant young prince raised among warriors and commanders. Now they watched as stories of divine ancestry circulated around him. Rumors spread that he was more than mortal. Some may have encouraged these beliefs for political reasons. Others may have genuinely accepted them. The problem was that once such ideas entered the center of power, they became difficult to separate from reality. Every victory reinforced them. Every act of obedience strengthened them. Every challenge to his authority appeared increasingly unacceptable. Yet the greatest danger was not that Alexander wanted others to see him differently. The greater danger was the possibility that he had begun seeing himself differently as well. History repeatedly shows what happens when leaders become surrounded by constant admiration, unlimited authority, and an environment where disagreement grows rare. The line between confidence and self-deification can become almost invisible. For Alexander, that line may already have been disappearing. Then came the night when years of tension, resentment, pride, and frustration exploded into a single moment of violence. A banquet filled with wine would expose cracks that had been forming for years. And before the night ended, one of the men most responsible for Alexander's survival would be dead at his hands. The night he killed the man who saved his life. Long before the tragedy that would shock Alexander's empire, there was a bond forged in war. Cleitus the Black was not merely another officer in the Macedonian army. He belonged to the generation that had helped build Alexander's success from the beginning. He had fought beside him through some of the most dangerous campaigns ever undertaken. More importantly, he was one of the few men alive who could speak to Alexander not as a distant ruler, but as someone who remembered the person behind the crown. Years earlier, during the Battle of Granicus, Alexander came within seconds of death. In the chaos of combat, enemy warriors closed in around him. One Persian nobleman raised his weapon to strike what could have been a fatal blow. Before the attack could land, Cleitus intervened. His action saved Alexander's life. Without that moment, the empire that later stretched across continents might never have existed. Few men had done more for Alexander's survival than Cleitus. But the empire of 328 BC was no longer the same world in which that act of loyalty had taken place. Alexander had become richer, more powerful, and increasingly surrounded by ceremonies emphasizing his exceptional status. Many of his old companions struggled to adapt to these changes. Some accepted them, others remained silent. Cleitus was neither of those men. He possessed a reputation for honesty, bluntness, and a willingness to speak openly even when doing so carried risks. The banquet began as many royal gatherings did. Wine flowed freely. Music filled the hall. Courtiers exchanged stories celebrating Alexander's victories. Yet beneath the surface, tension was already present. As the evening progressed, conversations turned toward praise of the king. Comparisons were drawn between Alexander and the great heroes of myth. Some accounts suggest that criticism of earlier Macedonian leaders, including Philip II, entered the discussion. For men who had served under both father and son, the subject was deeply sensitive. At some point, Cleitus spoke. Ancient sources differ on the exact words, but they agree on the outcome. He challenged the growing culture of flattery surrounding Alexander. He reminded those present that many victories had been won, not by one man alone, but by the sacrifices of countless soldiers and commanders. He defended Philip's achievements and questioned the tendency to elevate Alexander above everyone who had helped build the empire. In another setting, such criticism might have led to an argument. On this night, it became something far more dangerous. The exchange escalated rapidly. Wine amplified emotions. Pride fueled every response. Alexander reacted with visible anger. Cleitus refused to back down. The argument evolved from political disagreement into personal confrontation. Witnesses watched as decades of friendship, loyalty, and shared struggle collapsed before their eyes. Attempts were made to separate the men. Some tried calming the situation. Others sensed disaster approaching. But the momentum of the conflict had already become impossible to stop. Then came the moment that would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. Enraged beyond reason, he seized a spear and struck Cleitus. The man who had once saved his life fell dead. Silence replaced the noise of celebration. Shock spread through the room. The impossible had happened. Alexander, the conqueror of empires, had killed one of his oldest companions not on a battlefield, but during a drunken argument among friends. According to several ancient accounts, the realization hit him almost immediately. Grief, horror, and regret followed. Yet nothing could reverse what had been done. For many observers, the death of Cleitus became more than a tragic mistake. It became a warning. If even a trusted friend could die for speaking openly, what did that mean for everyone else around the king? The atmosphere inside Alexander's inner circle would never be the same again. And as fear quietly replaced trust, an even darker chapter was about to begin. The Empire of Fear. The death of Cleitus ended in a single violent moment. Its consequences lasted far longer. In the days that followed, Alexander reportedly fell into deep remorse. Ancient accounts describe a ruler overwhelmed by grief, refusing food, isolating himself, and struggling to accept what he had done. To some, this showed that the killing had been a terrible mistake rather than a calculated act. But regardless of his regret, the damage had already spread throughout the empire's highest circles. The issue was no longer whether Alexander felt guilty. The issue was whether anyone around him still felt safe. Before Cleitus died, trusted companions could disagree with the king and expect an argument. Afterward, disagreement carried a different meaning. Men who had once spoken freely became careful with every word. Conversations changed. Advisors weighed the risks of honesty against the dangers of silence. No decree announced this transformation. No law created it. Yet everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. The boundaries of acceptable criticism had become uncertain, and uncertainty is often more frightening than clear rules. Inside the royal court, loyalty became increasingly difficult to measure. Alexander ruled an empire unlike anything Macedonia had known before. Vast distances separated provinces. Regional governors controlled enormous resources. Military commanders possessed influence over thousands of soldiers. In such a system, suspicion could easily thrive. Every disagreement might conceal disloyalty. Every criticism might be interpreted as resistance. Every independent action could appear threatening when viewed through the lens of growing mistrust. The atmosphere surrounding Alexander grew heavier with each passing year. His companions still admired his brilliance. They still recognized his extraordinary achievements. Yet admiration and fear are not opposites. History repeatedly shows that powerful rulers often inspire both at the same time. The closer individuals stood to the center of power, the more dangerous their position became. The king relied on them, but he also watched them. And they, in turn, watched him, searching for signs of his mood, his intentions, and his tolerance for dissent. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that many threats facing Alexander were real. Conspiracies existed in the ancient world. Assassinations were common. Rival claimants to power never disappeared entirely. The empire contained countless enemies who would have welcomed his downfall. This reality created a perfect environment for suspicion to flourish. Genuine dangers mixed with imagined ones. Distinguishing between the two became increasingly difficult, especially for a ruler carrying the burden of controlling the largest empire on earth. As trust weakened, fear filled the empty space it left behind. Not fear of foreign armies, not fear of rebellion at the frontier, fear within the ruling circle itself. The men who had marched across continents together were becoming divided by uncertainty. They no longer worried only about enemies beyond the empire's borders. They worried about what might happen if they found themselves on the wrong side of the king's judgment. Soon, those fears would face their greatest test, because Alexander's growing suspicion was about to collide with one of the most controversial cases in ancient history. A conspiracy would emerge. Accusations would spread. Lives would hang in the balance. And more than 2,000 years later, historians still cannot agree on a crucial question. Was the threat real, or was it a product of a ruler who had begun seeing enemies where none existed? The conspiracies that may never have existed. By the time whispers of conspiracy began circulating through Alexander's camp, the atmosphere was already charged with tension. The empire had grown too large, the stakes too high, and the consequences of failure too severe. In such an environment, rumors could become weapons, suspicions could become evidence, and fear could become its own form of truth. It was under these conditions that one of the most controversial episodes of Alexander's reign unfolded. At the center of the storm stood Philotas, one of the most powerful men in the empire. He was not an outsider or a newly appointed official. He was the son of Parmenion, perhaps the most respected general in Alexander's entire military structure. Parmenion had served Alexander's father, Philip II. He had helped secure key victories during the conquest of Persia. His influence stretched across the army, and his loyalty had long seemed unquestionable. Together, father and son occupied positions of enormous importance. The crisis began when reports surfaced of a plot against Alexander's life. According to ancient accounts, information about a possible assassination had reached Philotas. The problem was not that he participated in the conspiracy. The problem was that he allegedly failed to report it immediately. What followed remains one of the great mysteries of Alexander's career. Was Philotas guilty of negligence? Was he protecting someone? Or had he become the target of political rivals looking for an opportunity to remove a powerful figure from the king's inner circle? The investigation quickly turned into a spectacle. Philotas was arrested and questioned. Under immense pressure, accusations multiplied. Ancient historians describe interrogations that may have involved torture, making the reliability of any confession deeply questionable. Some sources portray Philotas as arrogant and disconnected from his fellow officers, a man whose personality made him vulnerable when suspicion arose. Others suggest that evidence against him was weak and that the outcome may have been determined long before the investigation began. Alexander faced a decision that would reveal much about the changing nature of his rule. In earlier years, he often relied on personal bonds and trust, forged through shared hardship. Now he confronted the possibility that one of the empire's most influential families might represent a threat. Whether motivated by caution, fear, political necessity, or genuine belief in Philotas's guilt, he chose to act decisively. Philotas was condemned and executed. Yet the story did not end there. Far away from the trial stood Parmenion. The aging general had not been present to defend himself. No formal hearing awaited him. No opportunity to respond would ever come. Fearing that news of his son's execution could trigger rebellion or retaliation, Alexander ordered Parmenion's death as well. Messengers raced across the empire carrying instructions. One of the men most responsible for Alexander's rise to power was eliminated without ever standing before his king. It was a decision that stunned many contemporaries and continues to divide historians today. This is where certainty disappears and mystery begins. Some scholars argue that Alexander prevented a genuine threat that could have shattered the empire. Others believe the evidence was insufficient and that suspicion had begun replacing proof. The truth remains buried beneath conflicting accounts, lost testimonies, and centuries of debate. What survives is an unsettling possibility. Alexander may have executed dangerous conspirators, or he may have destroyed loyal servants because he no longer knew whom to trust. Whatever the truth, one fact is impossible to ignore. The deaths of Philotas and Parmenion sent a message across the empire. No rank offered protection. No past service guaranteed safety. No amount of loyalty could erase suspicion once it entered the king's mind. And as Alexander continued consolidating power, a disturbing pattern was beginning to emerge. He was no longer waiting for threats to reveal themselves. Increasingly, he seemed determined to eliminate them before they had the chance to exist. The secret. No one talks about. Most discussions about Alexander's darker side focus on individual events: the death of Cleitus, the execution of Philotas, the killing of Parmenion. These incidents are dramatic, controversial, and impossible to ignore. But they are not the real secret hidden within Alexander's story. They are symptoms of something deeper. To understand the transformation taking place, it is necessary to step back from the events themselves and examine the man at the center of them. When Alexander began his campaigns, he inspired extraordinary loyalty because he shared the hardships of his soldiers. He marched beside them. He fought beside them. He bled beside them. The distance between king and army was remarkably small by the standards of the ancient world. His men did not merely obey him, they believed in him. That bond became one of the greatest strengths behind his military success. It allowed him to accomplish feats that should have been impossible. Yet absolute power has a unique effect on human perception. The larger Alexander's empire became, the fewer people remained capable of challenging him. Victories silenced critics. Success validated decisions. Praise surrounded him from every direction. Governors sought his approval. Courtiers competed for his favor. Entire populations treated him as a figure of near supernatural importance. Over time, the environment around Alexander changed in a way that affects many powerful leaders. Honest disagreement became increasingly rare. The transformation was gradual enough that it may have gone unnoticed at first. There was no single day when Alexander became a different person. Instead, years of conquest slowly altered his relationship with reality. Every battlefield victory reinforced the belief that his instincts were superior. Every successful gamble strengthened his confidence. Every obstacle overcome made limitations seem less relevant. The qualities that had made him exceptional as a commander began evolving into something more dangerous when applied to governing an empire. Isolation became another hidden consequence of success. Alexander was constantly surrounded by people, yet he may have been increasingly alone. Few individuals possessed the authority to question him. Fewer still were willing to take the risk. The empire's future depended on his decisions. Its wealth flowed through his authority. Its armies followed his command. In such circumstances, relationships naturally change. Friends become subordinates. Advisors become careful. Conversations become filtered. A ruler can command the world while slowly losing meaningful contact with it. This is why Alexander's darkest secret was not murder. It was not paranoia. It was not even ambition. Those explanations are too simple. The deeper secret was transformation. The conqueror who once drew strength from the loyalty of others was becoming separated from the very people who had helped create his success. The more powerful he became, the harder it became for him to see himself through the eyes of ordinary men. Power was not merely changing his decisions, it was changing his identity. Ancient historians often struggled to describe this process directly, yet traces of it appear throughout their accounts. The growing embrace of divine status, the increasing suspicion toward longtime companions, the willingness to remove individuals once considered indispensable. Viewed separately, these incidents seem unrelated. Viewed together, they reveal a ruler gradually drifting away from the grounded reality that had once guided him. The transformation was psychological, political, and deeply human all at once. And then, just as Alexander stood at the height of his power, another mystery emerged. One that no military genius could solve. One that no army could defeat. One that would bring the greatest conqueror of the ancient world face to face with the single force he could never control. Death was approaching, and the circumstances surrounding it would become one of history's most enduring enigmas. A death surrounded by questions. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander entered Babylon as the most powerful man on earth. At just 32 years old, he controlled an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. New campaigns were already being planned. New territories remained on his maps. His ambitions showed no signs of slowing. To those around him, the future seemed to belong entirely to Alexander. Then, without warning, everything changed. Ancient accounts describe a series of banquets, celebrations, meetings, and military preparations taking place inside the city. Alexander appeared active and engaged with the enormous responsibilities of his empire. Yet somewhere during those final days, he became ill. The exact sequence of events remains frustratingly unclear. Some sources mention fever. Others describe growing weakness. As the days passed, the condition worsened. The man who had survived countless battles found himself fighting an enemy he could neither see nor command. What happened next became the foundation of one of history's greatest mysteries. Alexander gradually lost the ability to lead, speak, and move with the authority that had defined his life. His generals gathered around him. His soldiers waited anxiously for news. Across the empire, no one could imagine a world without Alexander at its center. Yet that unimaginable reality was unfolding before their eyes. The conqueror who had defeated kings and shattered empires was now confined to a bed, powerless against whatever was consuming him. Almost immediately, theories began to emerge. Some believed he had been poisoned. The idea spread because it seemed difficult to accept that a man so strong could simply fall victim to illness. Political motives certainly existed. Powerful individuals stood to gain from his death. Rivalries within the empire created fertile ground for suspicion. Yet poisoning presents its own problems. Many historians argue that the symptoms described by ancient writers do not fit a carefully planned assassination. Others remain unconvinced, pointing to the endless opportunities for intrigue surrounding a ruler of Alexander's stature. Disease offers another explanation. Babylon was a vast and complex city where infections could spread easily. Modern scholars have proposed everything from malaria and typhoid fever to other illnesses common in the ancient world. Exhaustion may also have played a role. For more than a decade, Alexander had pushed his body beyond ordinary limits. Endless campaigns, repeated wounds, harsh climates, and relentless pressure had accumulated over years. The empire saw a conqueror. The human body beneath the legend carried the consequences of every mile marched and every battle fought. Perhaps the reason this mystery continues to fascinate people is that it represents something larger than a medical question. Alexander spent his life overcoming obstacles that stopped everyone else. He crossed deserts. He climbed mountains. He defeated armies considered unbeatable. Again and again, he bent reality to his will. His death reminds us that even the most extraordinary individuals remain subject to forces beyond their control. No amount of power could negotiate with mortality. No military genius could outmaneuver it. As news of his death spread, shock rippled across the empire. But an even greater surprise was waiting. Alexander had spent years conquering the world. Yet he left behind no clear succession capable of preserving what he had built. The moment he disappeared, cracks that had been hidden beneath the surface began widening. And what happened next would force historians to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. If Alexander's empire was truly the masterpiece history remembers, why did it begin falling apart almost immediately after he was gone? The empire collapses immediately. The moment Alexander died, the illusion of unity began to disappear. For years, his empire had appeared unstoppable. It stretched across thousands of miles, connected countless cultures, and controlled immense wealth. To outside observers, it looked like the foundation of a new world order. Alexander's victories had been so overwhelming that many assumed his empire would endure for generations. Yet beneath the surface, a critical weakness had been growing unnoticed. The empire depended less on institutions than on the presence of a single man. The crisis emerged almost instantly. Alexander left behind no adult heir capable of taking control. There was no universally accepted successor waiting to inherit authority. There was no stable political system designed to manage a territory of such enormous size. Instead, there was uncertainty. His generals gathered to decide the future, but even they could not agree on what that future should look like. The empire Alexander had unified through force suddenly faced the question of who possessed the right to rule it. What followed was not an orderly transition. It was a struggle for survival. Men who had spent years fighting beside one another began competing for power. Alliances formed and collapsed. Promises were made and broken. Regions that had once answered to a single authority became battlegrounds for rival ambitions. The empire did not shatter in a single dramatic moment. It fractured piece by piece as commanders, governors, and military leaders pursued their own interests. The irony was impossible to ignore. Alexander had defeated external enemies across 3 continents, yet the greatest threat to his empire emerged from within. The same generals who helped build his achievements now became rivals in a contest over his legacy. Within a few years, vast territories were divided among competing successors. Wars erupted. Former allies turned against each other. The dream of a unified empire faded with astonishing speed. This collapse raises a question historians continue to debate. Why did a ruler famous for his vision fail to create a lasting succession plan? Some argue that Alexander believed he still had many years ahead of him. Others suggest that his relentless focus on conquest left little time for long-term political stability. There is also the possibility that no solution existed. The empire had expanded so rapidly that building durable institutions may have been impossible within his lifetime. Regardless of the explanation, the result remained the same. The structure he created proved unable to survive without him. In many ways, the fate of the empire reflects the transformation we have been tracing throughout this story. Alexander's greatest strength had always been his personal leadership. He inspired loyalty, courage, and action wherever he went. But personal leadership has limits. When systems depend entirely on one extraordinary individual, they often struggle to endure after that individual disappears. The empire's rapid fragmentation may reveal less about the ambitions of his successors and more about the nature of Alexander's rule itself. And that leads us to the final revelation. Because the collapse of the empire forces us to look beyond battles, conspiracies, and mysteries. It forces us to confront the central question hidden beneath Alexander's legend. What if the darkest secret he left behind was not something he did, but something he became? What if the very qualities that allowed him to conquer the world also prevented him from preserving it? The darkest secret revealed. After more than 2,000 years, people still search for Alexander's darkest secret in the wrong places. Some look for a hidden conspiracy. Others search for evidence of a murder, a lost document, a buried confession, or a mystery concealed somewhere within the ruins of the ancient world. These theories are fascinating because they offer simple answers. They suggest that one dramatic event can explain the contradictions surrounding Alexander's life. But history is rarely that simple. The truth often hides in plain sight, visible only when all the pieces are viewed together. The deaths of Cleitus, Philotas, and Parmenion were not isolated incidents. The growing obsession with divine status was not an isolated incident. The widening distance between Alexander and his closest companions was not an isolated incident. Neither was the collapse of trust within his inner circle. When examined separately, these events seem disconnected. When viewed as part of a larger pattern, they reveal something far more significant. They point toward a gradual transformation that unfolded over years rather than a single moment. Alexander's darkest secret was not that he became evil. The historical evidence does not support such a simplistic conclusion. Nor was it that he suddenly abandoned the qualities that made him extraordinary. The same courage, ambition, confidence, and determination remained present throughout his life. The tragedy is that those very qualities evolved as his power expanded. Strength became inflexibility, confidence became certainty, ambition became necessity. The traits that once fueled greatness began producing consequences that neither Alexander nor those around him fully understood. This is what makes his story so compelling. Alexander achieved something almost no human being has ever experienced. He reached the summit of worldly success while still a young man. He accumulated military victories beyond comparison. He commanded wealth, influence, and authority on a scale that few rulers could imagine. Yet instead of bringing stability, absolute success appears to have accelerated his separation from the people and realities that once kept him grounded. The conqueror continued winning battles while slowly losing perspective. Ancient historians often struggled with this contradiction. They admired Alexander's achievements. Many genuinely respected him. Yet they also preserved stories that challenged the heroic image. It is as though they recognized that the real Alexander could not be reduced to a simple legend. He was neither the flawless hero celebrated by later generations nor the tyrant depicted by some critics. He was something more complex and therefore more human. A man transformed by the unprecedented scale of his own success. The empire's fate reinforces this conclusion. Alexander conquered vast territories through personal brilliance, but he left behind a system unable to survive without him. The rapid fragmentation that followed his death exposed a reality hidden beneath the empire's grandeur. His greatest achievement depended heavily on his presence. Once he disappeared, so did the force holding everything together. The conqueror who mastered the external world could not fully master the consequences of his own rise. And perhaps that is the darkest secret history books often leave out. Not that Alexander failed, not that he was defeated, but that absolute success may have changed him in ways even he could not see. The greatest military genius of the ancient world spent years overcoming every obstacle placed before him, only to encounter the one challenge that no conqueror can escape: the subtle transformation that power exerts on the human mind. At the beginning of this story, we asked a simple question. Did Alexander conquer the world, or did power ultimately conquer Alexander? After following his rise, his victories, his transformations, and the collapse that followed his death, the answer is no longer as clear as it first seemed. Alexander unquestionably changed history. Few individuals have influenced the ancient world so profoundly. His campaigns redrew maps, connected civilizations, spread ideas across continents, and created a legacy that survived long after his empire disappeared. More than 20 centuries later, his name remains synonymous with ambition, courage, and military brilliance. His achievements were real. His genius was real. His impact was real. Yet history's most enduring figures are rarely remembered because they were perfect. They endure because they reveal something timeless about human nature. Alexander's story is not merely the story of a conqueror. It is the story of what happens when extraordinary talent meets extraordinary power. It is the story of a man who reached heights that few could imagine, only to face challenges that victory itself created. The young king who crossed into Asia inspired fierce loyalty because he shared danger with his men. He fought beside them. He suffered beside them. He earned their trust. But as the empire expanded, that relationship changed. Distance replaced familiarity. Admiration became reverence. Honest disagreement became increasingly rare. The transformation was gradual, almost invisible, yet its effects echoed through every chapter of his final years. Perhaps this is why Alexander continues to fascinate us. His life forces us to confront a difficult truth. Success is not always the end of a journey. Sometimes it creates new dangers. The qualities that help someone rise to greatness can become liabilities once greatness is achieved. Ambition can become obsession. Confidence can become certainty. Strength can become isolation. History's most powerful rulers often discover that conquering the external world is easier than understanding the changes taking place within themselves. When Alexander died in Babylon, the largest empire on earth stood at his feet. Within a remarkably short time, that empire fragmented. Generals became rivals. Allies became enemies. The structure that seemed invincible proved fragile. Yet even as the empire disappeared, the legend survived. That legend became so powerful that it often overshadowed the more complicated reality behind it, and perhaps that is the final irony. Alexander spent his life pursuing immortality through conquest. In one sense, he succeeded. His name outlived kingdoms, dynasties, and civilizations. But the deeper lesson of his story is not about immortality. It is about humanity. Behind every legend stands a person shaped by ambition, temptation, fear, hope, and change. Alexander was no exception. So when we remember the greatest conqueror of the ancient world, perhaps the most important battlefield was never Persia, Egypt, or India. It was the battlefield within. Because the most dangerous territory Alexander ever entered was not a distant land beyond the horizon. It was the human mind of the man who stood at the center of the world's greatest empire. The empire vanished. The mystery remains.